Good morning, and thank you for inviting me. Just a quick note, AquaSpy is we're a commercial soil moisture data service company, and yeah, we've been working with the TAWC, I think, since about 2009, but I've been working on the High Plains since before that. There's lots of sensors out there, and I encourage everyone to doesn't matter what you're using, to get involved with seeing what's going on underground, because that's where it's all happening. As irrigators, you pump water out of the ground and then put it back in the root zone. So you need to know where the roots are, and you need to know where that water's going, so it's available to the crop. So it's all about turning water into money, and what our technology is about is a probe that's 4 feet long, has 12 sensors, one every 4 inches down this probe, and it measures soil moisture, EC, and temperature at every sensor depth. So what I'm going to do is just have a look at the wetting patterns that we could expect from these different treatments, and then have a look at what the data shows and line that up with the yields that we saw. So Glenn's already showed you the wetting patterns from a drone picture from these treatments. We had 15 probes, there were 5 treatments, and there were 3 probes in each treatment. So I'm not going to show you everything, and it's going to be real hard to see some of this from up the back, so bear with me. But to start with, the LEPA, low energy precision application, so basically bubblers. We've got LDNs, which are low drift nozzles, so it's a different form of bubbler. Low energy spray application, so it's basically spray, but and then we've got the precision mobile drip irrigation, which is dragon line, or it's a mobile drip hose on the surface. So the treatments, there's probably a better picture that Glenn had in his presentation, and it's in the handout. But essentially, the spray was on the inside, and that's really important, I think, from what we see in the data, because it gets an unfair advantage compared to the LDN, which is on the outside and suffering from edge effects, I believe. So, and then the 2 LEPA treatments were further out than the dragon line or the spray application. And when you think about the time that the sprinkler has, or the nozzle has, when it passes over a certain given point, I believe that's actually impacting these results. So what can we expect when we have bubblers? So there were 2 setups. This was on 40-inch planted cotton, and there was a bubbler down every row, every furrow, and a bubbler down every other furrow. So we've got the LEPA on 40-inch and the LEPA on 80-inch. And so on 40-inch, the whole idea of bubbling water onto the surface is so you don't lose anything from evaporation to the basically blowing away in the wind. Get it to the soil surface quickly. And what you can expect, and you'll see the drone pictures that Glenn had in his presentation. It basically wet the entire soil surface, but what the idea here is, spray has a shallow pattern that marries up, whereas the bubblers tend to have a deeper wetting pattern. And so the water does, on 40-inch, tend to marry up between the furrows. But this, having a drop every 40 inches is a more expensive setup, obviously, than having a drop every 80 inches. So you need to weigh that into, or take that into consideration. But it does give you more flexibility with different planting configurations. For example, putting sorghum in on 20-inch rows. The bubbler on 80-inch rows, you're putting twice as much water out at every nozzle, and so you can expect a deeper wetting pattern, but you are likely to see more wet furrows and dry furrows, and so you need to take that into account. But as the data will show, we did actually get some marrying up. But one point I will note is that we had probes in the plant row, on the shoulder of the bed and in the furrow, but it was only on the wet side. We did not measure the dry side. So take that into, we'll keep that in the back of your mind. This is obviously a cheaper alternative because you've got half as many nozzles, but it gives you less flexibility, and you will get dry spots out there. So it gives you less flexibility as far as different planting configurations. So dry spots. Spray application, you're obviously putting water potentially into the atmosphere straight off, but we're keeping it low, so it's reducing that. But it's prone to evaporation, not just from the soil, but from the plants as well. So you get a wet surface, it's going to evaporate. Whereas if you get water straight onto the soil and not onto the plant, less evaporation. But it is hard, generally speaking, to get deep penetration of that water. This year was a little different, as we'll see. When it comes to the mobile drip, the Dragon line, it's essentially you're laying water down. It's like similar to bubble mode in terms of placement of water, but you've actually got a much longer soak time because you've got, depending on how far out along the span you are, you'll cut a length of drip tape to give you that flow rate that you need. So if you're on the outside of the pivot, you've got a very long hose to allow you to put that large volume of water out over a longer period of time, because you're basically governed by the emitter rate. And I'm sure the boys out with Dragonline can explain more about that. But the longer infiltration time is the key to that whole thing. So unlike bubble or the LDNs, where as that pivot moves around, it goes over that area very quickly, you've got a much longer soak time. And therefore, because you're cutting the length of tape to suit where you sit along the pivot, it's a lot more even. Rather than a large application volume in a very quick time, or a smaller application volume over a larger time if you're closer in on the pivot. Basic nozzle, I guess that fits with any nozzle package, but that soak time is important. So, and then we've got the low drift nozzles, essentially just spreading water over a larger area. And so you're expecting not just a deeper percolation, but also a wider percolation because you're wetting a larger area. So you should get fewer wet spots than fewer dry spots than the bubble mode on the 80-inch centers. So I'm going to look at a snapshot of this data, and I apologize that some of these graphs are going to be hard to read from up the back. They're in the notes. I've added a few extras. But we're going to look at basically the differences between the treatments, the differences between the 40 and 80-inch centers on the bubble mode, the bubble versus the mobile drip. Have a look at how these different treatments move water laterally, and then just talk about some of the other things, rainfall and EC. So these graphs, this line is basically all of the sensors added to, or averaged, and so it's what we call a summary graph. And that, think of it like a gas gauge in the soil. And so we've got a full point, which is this blue line at the top, and a refill point. And this green band is really what we're saying for cotton. If you can keep it in that band, you're going to do good things. So the other thing about irrigating cotton is that really in this short season environment, although this was a longer season, 2016, it stayed warmer for longer, but generally speaking, you make your money through the middle of the season, basically from first flower to peak bloom, and that's when you really got to put the hammer down. And from then on, you're really trying to tail off to the finish and just fill out the bowls that you've got when it comes to cotton growing. So it's all happening in that shaded zone in the middle, and the closer we can stay to this the full point, the better off we're going to be. We've got spray, had the highest yield, and actually did these are the probes that are in the plant line, and as you can see that the highest yield actually correlated with the ability to stay closest to the full point. The next highest yield was actually in the Dragon line. Same, we had lost some data unfortunately on this probe early in the season, but once again did a good job of staying close to that full point. The Leaper and the LDNs they had lower yield, but they also had a harder time keeping wet. Remembering that we're putting the water in the furrow and these are the probes in the plant line. So, and I'm actually pleasantly surprised that water did make it to the plant line, because I've seen plenty of occasions where it doesn't even make it that far. It stays very close, it doesn't move laterally. So the fact that we're seeing all the irrigations is a good thing, but the fact that it didn't stay wet right against the plant is, it's not unexpected, but as I'll point out later, the plant will find that water as well. So when you look at this graph, a lot of detail. Remember, I've got a probe with 12 sensors on it, and there's 12 colored lines on this graph. There's one for every sensor depth, 4 inches, 8 inches, 12 inches, and so on, down to 48 inches. So the top sensors are at the top of the graph, and the bottom sensors are at the bottom of the graph. So our 44 and 48 inch sensors are down the bottom. When the lines go up, it's sensing that water has hit that sensor level. So there's a lot more detail, and if you want, we've got a table outside. You can come and catch me in one of the breaks or later in the day. But take-home message here is that the spray, actually, there was a big rainfall that happened late in the season. And if I just back up a slide here, we can see that that was the highest point at all of these graphs. It was the leveler. And so it tended to fill the profile, fill the soil. And if we look at what happened all the way through the profile, you can actually see that the spray treatment didn't need to jump up very much in that bottom foot and a half. So from, basically 2.5 feet down, it was already full. It didn't jump up much. The PMDI jumped up a little bit at the lower levels in the third and fourth foot, but the leaper and the LDNs, the leaper on the 40s as well, jumped up a lot. So what that's telling me, it wasn't dry to start, but it wasn't fully wet either. The spray application on the inside of the circle seemed to have an unfair advantage that started wetter at depth. And so their starting moisture, I think, has got a little bit of had an impact here. When we look at the bubble mode, the 40-inch versus 80-inch, remember that 40 inches, you've got twice as many nozzles, and so you've got half the volume coming out of each one compared to the 80s. And so in the plant row, we can see up the top here is the 40-inch. There is a gap at the top of the graph here, but it's similar on both. So in terms of water is being placed in the furrow, is it soaking to the row? Yes, it is. Is it fully wetting the row? No, it's not. But when you look in the furrow, we can see that the 40 wasn't able to wet the furrow either. Compared to the 80, it got pretty wet. Once again, it validates what we expect because you're placing the water there and you're placing twice as much. So this data rings true to what you would hope to see. When we look at the separate layer graph, moisture graph, we can actually see when it comes to the 40s that we're having trouble getting water to penetrate. These lines, once again, might be hard to see up the back, but the top 3 lines are bumping up every time there's been an irrigation, but the sensor at 16 inches isn't moving. So even though we're bubbling water onto the surface at 40 inches, hard to get water to penetrate, even down to 16 inches. It's just wetting the top foot. When we look at the 80-inch centers, it's actually wetting all the way through the profile. It's doing it in the furrow, but it's also subbing across and doing it in the plant row as well. So the 80s are doing a good job. It might not look it from the surface, but when that water hits, and the other thing is that Glenn pointed out, he had sorghum there last year on 20-inch centers. And so basically the furrow, the old sorghum plant line was between the furrow and this year's plant row. And I think that that's really helping the water sub across, because what's actually happening is with zero till, he strip tilled, but essentially left last year's roots intact. And water, they tend to rot out, and water follows those root channels, and it really helps that water soak into the soil. If any of you have ever had a field, or you want to do your own test, if you have a wheat crop, a good wheat stubble, and you come in and you plough half the field and you leave the other half with a wheat stubble, and you get a 2-inch rain, guarantee you could walk out there on the wheat stubble a day after the rainfall and probably not get mud on your boots. You walk into the ploughed side of the field, you'll probably have to wait 3 days before you can walk in there for a start, and you'll have a lot of mud on your boots. Because what happens is, in that where you've got the stubble, the old root channels, they suck that water in and it follows the roots down, and it helps, you're creating pathways for water to get into the soil. If you come through and till that out, you've got no pathways, and that water will basically hit the bottom of that tilled layer and sit there and pond up and sit near the surface where it can evaporate, but it's what causes all that muddy mess. So I'm a big fan of no-till or strip-till. But if we look at what happened, so the 2 40-inch treatments, we've got the drag hose, the Dragon Line or the precision mobile drip versus the bubble mode. And straight off the bat you can see that as we pointed out before, having a hard time getting the plant line wet, whereas with the mobile drip, it's absolutely wetting the plant line. As we'll see in the next series of slides, I believe the drip tape actually was pulling across and putting the water right at the plant as opposed to in the furrow, so there is a difference there. But that's not a bad thing, it's just where the water was going, because we are very precise in where this water is being placed. So once again, we can see that with the bubble mode, hard time getting water to soak down into the soil. And so this is what I'd expect normally to see from a spray as opposed to a bubbler. But with the drip, mobile drip, we can see every time water comes on the top, we can see it going through. So there is a wet column of water in there. Water moves through wet soil, and it was able to keep it wet. And I believe that the longer soak time has something to do with that. So, wow, lots of information here. If you follow these along, we've got the mobile drip at the top, it goes all the way across. We've got the spray in the middle, goes across, and we've got the LDNs coming across. We've got the plant row. We've got the 10 inches off the plant row, which I've called the side of the bed, and then we've got the furrow. And so if you think about the matrix that way, what we can see with the mobile drip is that it placed water next to the plant. It did a pretty good job of watering the side of the bed, but not such a good job of watering the furrow. So I just think that with this, what's happened is that it's pulled across and it's tracking next to the plant. So you need to keep that in mind. As I said, not a bad thing, because they're every 40 inches, and so every plant row is getting watered, but it's just what this data is explaining to me. And then if we look at the spray, it basically wet as you would expect, nice even wetting pattern all the way across. But the thing about this spray is not only are you wetting right across the plant line and the furrow and the next plant line, but the fact that it's spreading water in front and behind of the path of the pivot as it moves around, and you're on the inside span, the innermost span, so it's moving the slowest. It's got the longest soak time of any of these treatments. So yes, the soil is staying wettest for longer, wetter for longer, and so you've got potentially a lot more evaporation, but you're on the inside span, so you're going to have the least or the highest humidity of any treatment out there. I can't comment, I didn't live the season, I can't comment on how hot and windy it was through the peak of that, but obviously the season extended, it was wet, and you got a lot of late growth, a lot of late yield development, but just the way the season was set up, I think that the spray got an unfair advantage. And so then we look at the LDN. Remember, it was the outermost span. It was on the outside, so it had the least. Had the hardest road to go there, and it did have trouble getting water fully wet at the plant line. Same with the side of the bed, but we're putting water in the furrow, and it did better there where the water was being placed. So it's not unexpected, but I just think that the soak time in terms of how fast that pivot is moving on the outside, and the extra or the lower humidity, the edge effects probably unfairly or put the LDN at a disadvantage. So that's basically a summary of what I just showed you. I don't need to read it's mainly for the proceedings, but explaining that the wetting patterns did tend to follow what I would expect, except that the dragon line tended to track along the plant row. But I won't dwell on that. It's just really a written summary of what we found. You can look that up in the proceedings. So what are some of the take-homes here? Just some of the broad brush results. Well, water was able to sub across to the plant line. And as I said, if you went back to 2011, that wouldn't have happened. In a hot, dry year, we had to move a lot of probes that we would normally place in the plant line. People put their flip the pads, put it in bubble mode. The water didn't move to the plant line at all, and we weren't seeing the irrigations. So that was a problem in that year. This year, not a problem. So water was definitely was moving. All the treatments used all the moisture in the soil. Nothing was left. It was all taken up, And so that in itself is a good thing too. So they all were able to access all the moisture that was available in the soil, in the top 4 feet. So the 40-inch bubble mode, the leaper, 40-inch spacing, didn't wet the soil as deeply as the dragon line. And so you're theoretically putting the same volume of water out. You've got 40-inch nozzle spacing. If you've got the right nozzle package and everything else, they're putting the same volume. The thing is, with the bubble mode, it's putting it out in basically a 1 foot puddle as it advances around. Whereas with the dragon line, you might have 50 feet of drip hose out there. So you've got a lot of time that water can soak into the soil. And I think that really is borne out in these results. It showed that it does help get that water into the soil, for sure. The 40-inch bubble mode wasn't able to wet as deeply as the 80-inch bubble mode. Well, that stands to reason as well, because you're putting twice as much water out, but you've only got half as many nozzles. So it's one of those things that you've got to think about planting configurations. What are you going to do in your next crop? Are you always going to stick on 40-inch centres, or are you on 20s, or are you growing wheat or other things? So you can have the tendency to get wet rows and dry rows with 80-inch centres. But in this situation, that didn't happen. It was marrying up. So you've got to think about that volume, but also the application rate. And the application rate, you can take higher application rates if your soil can absorb that water. And so whatever you can do to help your soil absorb that water is going to be a good thing. Number one is don't till it. If you can get by with no-till or strip-till, it's going to be a whole lot better than conventional cultivation. If you can put a cover crop out there, then that's going to be a really nice thing too. So, yeah, the volume, but the application rate has a significant impact on the effectiveness. So it's not just getting it to the soil, it's getting it into the soil that counts. So the Lisa system, the spray, had an advantage, as I've mentioned a few times. You could say I'm trying to doctor the results. I'm not. It got the highest yield and it had the best water availability, so they marry up. But why was it contrary to conventional thinking? I think the inside really gave it a huge advantage. So I'd like to next time see it mixed up or have some kind of replication. Hard to do, but yeah, just had a longer soak time, probably lower humidity, and I've got to say I still think there was some better starting moisture out there for whatever reason. I'm not sure. The LDN 80 outperformed the Leaper, so Leaper did well. But with a small conversion, you could probably do even better with the low drift nozzles. The Leaper 40, it performed strongly. It had the third highest yield, but obviously there's a cost of conversion there to put the extra drops out there. But once again, it gives you flexibility. And the PMDI, it gives you the most even soak time. It's going to give you the most even results, but it comes at a cost. And so it's one of those things you've got to factor in. I haven't done any economics. I'm not going to. That's you can go and talk to the boys outside. And I'm not sure about the maintenance. I just put that out there because of where the lines run and that sort of thing. You still got to get the water into the soil. We measured EC conductivity, electrical conductivity. So we've been using that to track fertilizer, changes in fertilizer or changes in salt levels. If you had salty water and you're putting a small amount of, wetting a small volume of soil, you can start to concentrate salts, which is a bad thing. If you're putting the water if you're putting fertilizer out in your irrigation system, then that's a good thing. You're concentrating the fertilizer where your roots are. And so bottom line here was we did not see any changes in EC. We didn't expect to, but it was just I've included that. Essentially, wetter soil is more conductive, warmer soil is more conductive, and that all the differences there can be explained through temperature and moisture. And I didn't see any other differences. Let's talk about rainfall. So we talked about the fact that August and September had 7 3/4 inches of rain. Well, when did it fall? I've highlighted these arrows. If you put the peak irrigation season, there was basically a really nice irrigation that happened right in the middle of that zone, which came from Mother Nature. And these rainfall records came from Plainview, just public records. But then in the back half of the season, obviously irrigation stopped, and there was a lot of rain that fell in September, or right at the end of August and into September, and that enabled the crop to finish out. As I said, all of the graphs finished up down here. They all used all the moisture, but it really helped. It was a nice deficit finish. Things didn't really go that vegetative, and if they did, they were able to finish out the fruit, so you got the full benefit of that. But this rainfall would have been a leveler, so it would have tended to level out those yields for sure, because there was a lot of late fruit, as I understand it. So as far as mitigating factors, I think the rain obviously made an effect. I talked about where the water is placed, and that's really important. The smaller the strip of water, which is a good thing because you don't have wet soil to evaporate moisture and lose it to the environment, but you've got to make sure that you line up. That's why we call it precision irrigation. You've got to line that up with where the plant is. So Glenn explained to me privately that there was some setup issues to do with pressure regulators and nozzle packages and just trying to get that right. I only throw it out there because I'm just unsure as to whether prior to the season there was the same amount of water put out for every treatment. So as I said, I think the inside of the circle was probably getting a little bit more, and maybe that happened prior to pressure regulators being put on there. I couldn't tell you, but that's my gut feeling. And Glenn also mentioned that the spray treatment did get a slight advantage being harvested before a significant rain. So was he able to, did it drop the yield a little bit for the other four treatments? Not sure. So some take-homes here. Yeah, consider nozzle spacing versus the application rate. It's, and really the second point is almost more important, that the plant will find the water. So if you put water at 80-inch spacings in a strip, the plant will find it if you can get it started. That's the key thing here. You've got to be able to germinate the crop, you've got to get it up and growing, and it will find the moisture, but you've got to get it there and get it over that hump. And obviously different plants have different root types, so cotton is tap-rooted, corn and sorghum are fibrous rooted, so they have a better chance of finding that water than cotton. But yeah, you might need a different establishment strategy to get that plant going. Obviously with bubble mode, you start out in spray mode and you flip the pads and you end up in bubble mode. That's great. But if you're trying to look at some other strategies, then germination can be an issue. I truly believe, despite what the 2016 results say, that subsurface drip is the gold standard as far as efficiency, then mobile drip, then your LDNs, then your LEPA, then your spray. So while spray came out as the highest yield in this treatment, I still, year in, year out, I would put it, and there's no controversy here. I'm agreeing with conventional wisdom, but I see no reason, despite these results, to buck that trend. And the trouble is, the more precise you are, especially subsurface drip, the harder it is to germinate a crop. You've got to get that water to move up and out, and so that spacing of where you place it becomes more and more critical. And so it's tough. So the precision irrigation requires precision planting and precision management. But you're getting down to that level of precision because you can't afford to waste it. It's too precious. And as I said, water will follow old root channels, so don't discount what happens in the previous season because that's your setup. And water, you'll take storms. If you can leave that stubble there, you're going to harvest storm rain so much better than if you don't. And so I'll just leave you with a couple of slides. This was from the Lockney area. These are bubblers. It's sort of hard to see, so I put the arrows in there. But you can see that this drop was supposed to be closer. Well, they were actually supposed to be down the middle, and they weren't where they were supposed to be. And if the water doesn't go where the plants are, I said they'll find it, but maybe they didn't get going enough. And there's a whole patch in here that they've lost plants, probably didn't germinate. So the more precise you are with your water, the more precise you've got to be all the way down the line. And make sure that you do put that water where you're supposed to put it, because it will count. And finally, a little bit of an advert here. I've showed you a lot of graphs, and as a producer, there's so much information in those graphs, it's where you want to end up. But if you asked me to try and diagnose a broken leg by looking at an x-ray, I couldn't do it. And to most of you looking at graphs, it's sort of the same way. It's a fuzzy picture. So what we've done as a company is actually taken all that information and presented it back as a picture, where you can have a gas gauge showing how much water is in the active part of the root zone. You've got a picture showing how deep the roots are, which grows through the season. And you've got a picture down the side here that shows you how deep the last irrigation penetrated, so it lights up the different sensor depths. And so all of that information on the graphs is still there, and you can drill down and look at things post-season, but in the thick of it, you can take a quick 30-second look and know exactly how deep my roots are, that's my target, am I getting water on target, how am I going as far as, am I staying in the zone I should be at that time of the year. So that's my little plug. If anyone's got any information, I'll be around all day. We've got a table outside, so come and see me. But thank you.